The Necromancer by Arthur Gray and read by Christopher Holton. This is a story of Jesus College, and it relates to the year 1643. In that year, Cambridge town was garrisoned for the Parliament by Colonel Cromwell and the troops of the Eastern Counties Association. Soldiers were billeted in all the colleges, and contemporary records testify to their violent behaviour and the damage which they committed in the chambers which they occupied. In the previous year, the Master of Jesus College, Dr. Sterne, was arrested by Cromwell when he was leaving the chapel, conveyed to London, and there imprisoned in the Tower. Before the summer of 1643, 14 of the 16 fellows were expelled, and during the whole of that year there were, besides the soldiers, only some 10 or 12 occupants of the college. The names of the two fellows who were not ejected were John Boylston and Thomas Allen. With Mr. Boylston, this history is only concerned for the part which he took on the occasion of the visit to the college of the notorious fanatic William Dowsing. Dowsing came to Cambridge in December 1642, armed with powers to put in execution the Ordinance of Parliament for the reformation of churches and chapels. Among the devastations committed by this ignorant clown, and faithfully recorded by him in his diary, it stands on record that on December the 28th, in the presence and perhaps with the approval of John Boylston, he digged up the steps, that is, of the altar, and brake down superstitions and angels, 120 at the least. Dowsing's account of his proceedings is supplemented by the Latin history of the college, written in the reign of Charles II, by one of the fellows, a certain Dr. John Sherman. Sherman records, but Dowsing does not, that there was a second witness of the desecration, Thomas Allen. Of the two, he somewhat enigmatically remarks, the one, that is Boylston, stood behind a curtain to witness the evil work. The other, afflicted to behold the exequies of his alma mater, made his life a filial offering at her grave, and to escape the hands of wicked rebels, laid violent hands on himself. That Thomas Allen committed suicide seems a fairly certain fact, and that remorse for the part which he had unwillingly taken in the sacrilege of December 28th prompted his act we may accept on the testimony of Sherman. But there is something more to tell which Sherman either did not know or did not think fit to record. His book deals only with the college and its society. He had no occasion to remember Adoniram Byfield. Byfield was a chaplain attached to the parliamentary forces in Cambridge, and quarters were assigned to him in Jesus College, in the first floor room above the gate of entrance. Below his chamber was the porter's lodge, which at that time served as the armoury of the troopers who occupied the college. Above it, on the highest floor of the gate tower, kept Thomas Allen. These were the only rooms on the staircase. At the beginning of the long vacation of 1643, Allen was the only member of the college who continued to reside. Some light is thrown on the character of Byfield and his connection with this story by a pudgy volume of old sermons of the Commonwealth period, which is contained in the library of the college. Among the sermons which are bound up in it is one which bears the date 1643 and is designated on the title page, a faithful admonition of the varlet sin of enchanters and stargazers, preached to the Colonel Cromwell's soldiers in St. Pulchre's, that is St. Sepulchre's Church in Cambridge, by the fruitful minister Adoniram Byfield, late departed unto God in the year 1643, touching that of Acts the 7th, verse 43, yea, took up the tabernacle of Moloch, the star of your god Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. The discourse, in its title as in its contents, reveals its author as one of the fanatics who wrought on the ignorance and prejudice against carnal learning which actuated the Cromwellian soldiers in their brutal usage of the university scholars in 1643. All Byfield's learning was contained in one book, the Book. For him, the revelation which gave it sufficed for its interpretation. What needed Greek to the man who spoke mysteries in unknown tongues? or the light of comment to him who was carried in the spirit into the radiance of the third heaven. Now Alan too was an enthusiast, lost in mystic speculation. His speculation was in the then novel science of mathematics and astronomy, even to minds not darkened by the religious mania that possessed Byfield that science was clouded with suspicion in the middle of the 17th century. Anglican, Puritan and Catholic were agreed in regarding its great exponent Descartes as an atheist. Mathematicians were looked upon as necromancers, and Thomas Hobbes says that in his days at Oxford the study was considered to be smutched with the black art, and fathers, from an apprehension of its malign influence, refrained from sending their sons to that university. How deep the prejudice had sunk into the soul of Adoniram his sermon shows. The occasion which suggested it was this. A pious cornet, leaving a prayer meeting at night, fell down one of the steep, unlighted staircases of the college and broke his neck. 2 or 3 of the troopers were taken with a dangerous attack of dysentery. There was talk of these misadventures among the soldiers, who somehow connected them with Alan and his studies. The floating gossip gathered into a settled conviction in the mind of Adoniram. For Alan was a mysterious person, whether it was because he was engrossed in his studies, or that he shrank from exposing himself to the insults of the soldiers. He seldom showed himself outside his chamber. Perhaps he was tied to it by the melancholy to which Sherman ascribed his violent end. In his 3-month sojourn on Alan's staircase, Byfield had not seen him a dozen times, and the mystery of his closed door awakened the most fantastic speculations in the chaplain's mind. For hours together in the room above, he could hear the mumbled tones of Alan's voice, rising and falling in ceaseless flow. No answer came, and no word that the listener could catch conveyed to his mind any intelligible sense. Once the voice was raised in a high key, and Byfield distinctly heard the ominous ejaculation, "Avaunt, Sathanas, avaunt!" Once through his partly open door, he had caught sight of him standing before a board chalked with figures and symbols, which the imagination of Byfield interpreted as magical. At night from the court below, he would watch the astrologer's lighted window, and when Alan turned his perspective glass upon the stars, the conviction became rooted in his watcher's mind that he was living in perilous neighbourhood to one of the peeping and muttering wizards of whom the Holy Book spoke. An unusual occurrence strengthened the suspicions of Byfield. One night he heard Alan creep softly down the staircase past his room, and opening his door, he saw him disappear round the staircase foot, candle in hand. Silently in the dark, Byfield followed him and saw him pass into the porter's lodge. The soldiers were in bed and the armoury was unguarded. Through the lighted pane he saw Alan take down a horse pistol from a rack on the wall. He examined it closely, tried the lock, poised it as if to take aim, then replaced it and, leaving the lodge, disappeared up the staircase with his candle. A world of suspicions rushed on Byfield's mind, and they were not allayed when the soldiers reported in the morning that the pistols were intact. But one of the 6 soldiers died that week. Brooding on this incident, Adoniram became more than ever convinced of the satanic purposes and powers of his neighbour, and his suspicions were confirmed by another mysterious circumstance. As the weeks passed, he became aware that at a late hour of night Alan's door was quietly opened. There followed a patter of scampering feet down the staircase, succeeded by silence. In an hour or 2 the sound came back. The patter went up the stairs to Alan's chamber, and then the door was closed. To lie awake waiting for this ghostly sound became a horror to Byfield's diseased imagination. In his bed he prayed and sang psalms to be relieved of it. Then he abandoned thoughts of sleep and would sit up waiting if he might surprise and detect this walking terror of the night. At first, in the darkness of the stairs, it eluded him. One night, light in hand, he managed to get a glimpse of it as it disappeared at the foot of the stairs. It was shaped like a large black cat. Far from allaying his terrors, the discovery awakened new questionings in the heart of Byfield. Quietly he made his way up to Alan's door. It stood open, and a candle burnt within. From where he stood he could see each corner of the room. There was the board scribbled with hieroglyphs. There were the magical books open on the table. There were the necromancer's instruments of unknown purpose. But there was no live thing in the room, and no sound save the rustling of papers disturbed by the night air from the open window. A horrible certitude seized on the chaplain's mind. This thing that he had caught sight of was no cat. It was the evil one himself, or it was the wizard translated into animal shape. On what foul errand was he bent? Who was to be his new victim? With a flash there came upon his mind the story how Phinehas had executed judgment on the men that were joined to Baal-peor, and had stayed the plague from the congregation of Israel. He would be the minister of the Lord's vengeance on the wicked one, and it should be counted unto him for righteousness unto all generations for evermore. He went down to the armoury in the porter's lodge. 6 pistols he knew were in the rack on the wall. Strange that tonight there were only 5, a fresh proof of the justice of his fears. One of the 5 he selected, primed, loaded, and cocked it in readiness for the wizard's return. He took his stand in the shadow of the wall at the entrance of the staircase. That his aim might be surer, he left his candle burning at the stair foot. In solemn stillness the minutes drew themselves out into hours, while Adoniram waited and prayed to himself. Then, in the pouring darkness, he became sensible of a moving presence, noiseless and unseen. For a moment it appeared in the light of the candle, not 2 paces distant. It was the returning cat. A triumphant exclamation sprang to Byfield's lips. God shall shoot at them, suddenly shall they be wounded. And he fired. With the report of the pistol there rang through the court a dismal outcry, not human nor animal, but resembling, as it seemed to the excited imagination of the chaplain, that of a lost soul in torment. With a scurry the creature disappeared in the darkness of the court, and Byfield did not pursue it. The deed was done that he felt sure of, and as he replaced the pistol in the rack, a gush of religious exaltation filled his heart. That night there was no return of the pattering steps outside his door, and he slept well. Next day the body of Thomas Allen was discovered in the grove which girds the college, his breast pierced by a bullet. It was surmised that he had dragged himself thither from the court. There were tracks of blood from the staircase foot, where it was conjectured that he had shot himself, and a pistol was missing from the armoury. Some of the inmates of the court had been aroused by the discharge of the weapon. The general conclusion was that recorded by Sherman, that the fatal act was prompted by a brooding melancholy. Of his part in the night's transactions Byfield said nothing. The grim intelligence succeeding the religious excitation of the night brought to him questioning, dread, horror. Whatever others might surmise, he was fatally convinced that it was by his hand that Allen had died. Pity for the dead man had no place in the dark cabin of his soul. But how was it with himself? How should his action be weighed before the awful throne? His lurid thought pictured the great judgment as already begun, the book opened, the accuser of the brethren standing to resist him, and the dreadful sentence of Cain pronounced upon him, "Now art thou cursed from the earth." In the evening he heard them bring the dead man to the chamber above his own. They laid him on his bed, and closing the door, left him and descended the stairs. The sound of their footsteps died away, and left a dreadful silence. As the darkness grew, the horror of the stillness became insupportable. How he yearned that he might hear again the familiar muffled voice in the room above, and in an access of fervour he prayed aloud that the terrible present might pass from him, that the hours might go back, as on the dial of Ahaz, and all might be as yesterday. Suddenly, as the prayer died on his lips, the silence was broken. He could not be mistaken. Very quietly he heard Alan's door open, and the old pattering steps crept softly down the stairs. They passed his door. They were gone before he could rise from his knees to open it. A momentary flash lighted the gloom in Byfield's soul. What if his prayer was heard? If Alan was not dead? If the events of the past 24 hours were only a dream and a delusion of the wicked one? Then the horror returned intensified. Alan was assuredly dead. This creeping thing, what might it be? For an hour in his room, Byfield sat in agonized dread. Most the thought of the open door possessed him like a nightmare. Somehow it must be closed before the foul thing returned. Somehow the mangled shape within must be barred up from the wicked powers that might possess it. The fancy gripped and stuck to his delirious mind. It was horrible, but it must be done. In a cold terror he opened his door and looked out. A flickering light played on the landing above. Byfield hesitated. But the thought that the cat might return at any moment gave him a desperate courage. He mounted the stairs to Alan's door. Precisely as yesternight it stood wide open. Inside the room the books, the instruments, the magical figures were unchanged, and a candle exposed to the night wind from the casement threw wavering shadows on the walls and floor. At a glance he saw it all, and he saw the bed where a few hours ago the poor remains of Alan had been laid. The coverlet lay smooth upon it. The dead necromancer was not there. Then, as he stood, foot-bound at the door, a wandering breath from the window caught the taper, and with a gasp the flame went out. In the black silence he became conscious of a moving sound. Nearer, up the stairs they drew, the soft creeping steps, and in panic he shrank backwards into Alan's room before their advance. Already they were on the last flight of the stairs, and then, in the doorway, the darkness parted and Byfield saw. In a ring of pallid light that seemed to emanate from its body, he beheld the cat. Horrible, gory, its foreparts hanging in ragged collops from its neck. Slowly it crept into the room, and its eyes, smoking with dull malevolence, were fastened on Byfield. Further he backed into the room, to the corner where the bed was laid. The creature followed. It crouched to spring upon him. He dropped in a sitting posture on the bed, and as he saw it launch itself upon him, he closed his eyes and found speech in a gush of prayer. "Oh my God, make haste for my help!" In an agony he collapsed upon the couch and clutched its covering with both hands. Beneath it he gripped the stiffened limbs of the dead necromancer, and when he opened his eyes the darkness had returned and the spectral cat was gone. The end.